Hello, everyone. Today I want to talk to you about some of the ancestral histories of the Southwest, and we're going to begin talking about the Hohokam. The area in question here is largely in southern Arizona and northern Sonora. And beginning by at least 1000 BCE, we see canal irrigation, largely for crops such as maize and cotton, throughout this area, from the Rio Sonora all the way up to the Gila and Salt River drainages of southern Arizona. This is called the early agricultural or formative period in this region. And during this time period, we see small family settlements on floodplains at ideal locations. Agriculture in this region and throughout the Southwest, in fact, appears to have preceded the emergence of large settled villages. It makes a certain amount of sense given the productivity of the landscape being relatively low and the lack of any significant quantities of naturally occurring aquatic or marine resources accessible to populations of this area. In the Sonoran Desert, in fact, the development of water control technology and irrigation supported this emergence in the region referred to as the Hohokam cultural tradition. Here you can see a map of the geographic distributions of some of the more widespread and chronologically expansive archaeological traditions in the Southwest. The Ancestral Puebloan, once referred to as we spoke about in class as the Anasazi, in the area of the Four Corners there in the north. You see here the Mogollon, that's the correct pronunciation for that in the region, Mogollon in Spanish. There in the area of southeastern Arizona, southern New Mexico, western panhandle of Texas, and a great deal of the Mexican state of Chihuahua and the eastern part of the Mexican state of Sonora. And then you see the Hohokam. On this particular map, it is shown as not extending very far across the U.S.-Mexican border, but more recent research has indicated that it, in fact, was extensively distributed in the northern part of the Mexican state of Sonora as well, and further down the Gila River than is shown on this map. But what characterizes the Hohokam in general as an archaeological tradition is a coherent and very distinctive regional system of iconography, ritual, cremation mortuary customs, exotic trade items, and the creation of public architecture above and beyond simply residential or storage facilities, as is seen widely throughout the Southwest region. Here you actually see public architecture and large-scale public works projects, and we'll talk about some of those critical ones here in a second. Obviously with deeper roots in the region, but where we begin to see the coalescence of this particular style is referred to as the Hohokam pre-classic period. And it dates to between around 700 to 1150 CE of the Common Era, sometimes referred to as AD, as you recall. Excavations at one of the most important Hohokam sites to have been investigated by archaeologists, that of Snaketown, Arizona, on the Gila River, revealed that the houses for this time period were single-roomed structures made of wattle and daub with thatched roofs. And you would see 3 or 4 of these structures arranged around small courtyards or plazas. And interpretations not only of this architectural layout, but of other patterns of artifact use and distribution of even body parts of deer and turkeys and whatnot amongst these houses, in the deposits associated with these houses, has indicated that these are representative of corporate kin groups, sort of these extended families living around in these small compounds with their own little plaza or courtyard. These extended family, corporate kin group complexes were then organized around larger central plazas, many of which during this time period included ball courts. One of the things that can distinguish archaeologically a pre-classic Hohokam site as being a significant location rather than merely a field house or a processing station or a very small hamlet is the presence of a ball court. If there's a ball court, this is a local center of trade, of population, of craft specialization, all of these things, and it goes along with the presence of these ball courts. They are a very strong marker of the significance of these sites. And these villages, many of the centers that contain these ball courts and complex organized corporate kin group complexes, housed as many as 1,000 to 2,000 people. In the case of Snaketown, estimates may indicate that it may have housed as many as 3,500 people at one time. And what's supporting all of this are the incredible Hohokam irrigation systems. These are the most sophisticated irrigation systems in North America, north of Mesoamerica. Not even the Mississippian groups in the eastern part of the continent were able to equal the level of both complexity and hydraulic engineering and construction expertise that the Hohokam brought to bear in creating this most fundamental component of their public works, their collective organized labor. The main diversion channels of these systems had stone-paved headgates leading to distribution canals, each of which had their own headgate systems. You can see an aerial photograph here showing kind of the size and scale of some of these, a larger scale map of the Salt River area, where you can see the main course of the river and then all of those canals feeding off of it, some of which to some very significant locations such as Las Colinas, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And on the bottom right here, you actually see an aerial photograph right there near in the Phoenix Basin. You can actually, right there near the airport, I don't know if you've ever flown in or out of Phoenix, but right there you can actually see from the air some of the traces of these Hohokam irrigation systems, just to give you an idea of the scale of these things. Some of these main diversion canals were the width of a modern runway at a modern international airport. So we're not talking about little ditches that people are kind of scratching into the dirt to get a little bit of water off the river. We're talking about massive construction projects that had to be created and maintained. And what's really significant about that is that you have to have enough organized labor in order to construct and maintain such elaborate systems. Here you can see some other photographs showing the scale, the depth, and these aren't even main diversion canals. These are some of the distribution canals shown here. And you can see that photograph on the left. You've got multiple stages of construction and refinement and relining and whatnot. So they would have gone to the trouble of blocking these off at the different head gates and resurfacing the bottom so you didn't get too much leakage. You would have resurfaced them with clay so that it didn't just all percolate down into the soil so that you could actually get flow. And they would actually change the shape of these canals so that you would get different kinds of water flow. If you have ones that are deep and broad at the bottom, that's going to cause water to flow more evenly throughout the whole column, and so you're going to get slower movement of water at the surface. If you have a very narrow base, that's going to make the water move more quickly through this. So depending on whether you're trying to shape the canal for the point at which it's going to go onto the fields. You don't want it to be moving too quickly. Or if you're trying to get the water quickly from one place to another before it evaporates, this is still southern Arizona, so it can get warm enough to evaporate water if you're trying to move it over any significant distance. And you see from the scale of these maps that these were extensive irrigation systems. Really, really remarkable, the level of planning. These are not just kind of organically dendritic systems either. An incredible amount of planning had to go into this. You had to calculate how far up the river you needed to have your main diversion channel enter, or to draw water off of the river, depending on where you wanted those fields to be irrigated, because the diversion canal has to be higher than your most distant head gate for irrigating a field. And so you have to be able to understand topography and distance and angle and slope and all of these things to effectively construct such large and sophisticated systems. These produced an agricultural system that was highly, highly productive. Given the location and the length of the growing season in southern Arizona, you were likely able to get multiple harvests per year out of some of these fields before the onset of the Little Ice Age in sometime around 1400-ish, and extending until at least 1750. This is a major event in global climate change, but one that certainly impacted the Hohokam, as we'll talk about in a second. The elements that were also part of this canal system is really fascinating, because there's now strong evidence that it included elements of aquaculture, with fish and reeds and turtles being intentionally introduced into these irrigation systems. So as you're irrigating your fields, you've also got catfish and turtles and reeds, which can be the roots of the tule reed can be eaten, and the reed itself can be useful for creating those thatched roofs on the houses. So it was a very, very integrated system on a whole bunch of levels. And this is just, the system in the actual irrigated areas. As we'll talk about in a minute, there was also extensive landscape management that was being conducted by these people. The Hohokam Classic period, which lasted about 300 years, from 1150 to 1450 CE, is seen as a period of reorganization, right? When we talk about the ancestral Puebloan folks and we talk about the collapse of Chaco, that's happening around 1150. So the ancestral Puebloan system of the Four Corners area begins to encounter severe difficulties and the collapse of some of its larger systems at the beginning of what gets called the Hohokam Classic period. Now, it was not something that didn't go without notice in the Hohokam region at all. It required a significant change in the structure of society and the organization of labor, but they were able to come up with solutions that allowed their society to continue through this major disruption. One of the things that we see is the extensive use of adobe, massive walled constructions to build these large walled multi-storied enclosures. Cremation of the deceased was replaced by inhumation, so burials instead of cremations at this point. And these large platform mounds replace the ball courts as the primary form of public architecture. And these platform mounds appear to have been places for the performance of ritual, the internment of offertory caches, so placing offerings inside these platform mounds, and rather than places where you had principal leaders or anything like a ruler being buried in the platform mound. It was a large stage for the performance of particular rituals. And there's a strong indication that these were not open access to everyone in the community, very restricted access to some of these ritual stages. However, they were a new form of public architecture that had not had as prominent a place in the earlier time period. During this period, you see a contraction of population during the time period before the medieval drought that hit everybody in the Southwest like a ton of bricks. You had had the widest geographic extent of the Hohokam system. And during this period of reorganization, you see a lot of these peripheral areas being abandoned. And a compression of population into the core sections of the Gila and Salt rivers. There in the Phoenix, Tempe, Scottsdale, Glendale kind of area there of southern Arizona. And this is interesting because it kind of suggests that there was an incentive for having fewer smaller or fewer larger centers of population rather than spreading out as much as possible across the landscape. This is the period of the great houses of the Hohokam. Places like the sites of Las Colinas that you saw on that earlier map and Casa Grande shown here, along with a lot of the other large settlements of that core region, were located at the ends of these canal systems, likely indicating the formation of these irrigation communities as discrete political units. Between 1020 and 1160 CE, irrigation began to become more and more difficult in the region as the water tables dropped, but then you had alternating periods with infrequent but large and destructive floods. So overall, the pattern is that things are getting drier. You're losing a lot of the ambient moisture and rainfall agriculture potentials, usually in the upland areas. And you're getting a pattern where the monsoons, which usually would come every summer to this region, become highly unpredictable. But if you have a reduction in ground cover, if you have soils that have been dried out, and then all of a sudden you get a big rainstorm, we know in California what happens then. You get mass wasting events, you get mudslides, you get soil washing out, you get creeks and streams down cutting in their channels. And that was a huge problem for the Hohokam, is that as these stream beds cut further down, that meant you had to go farther upstream to begin your diversion canal. And any diversion canal that you had had before that stream cut deeper into its bed was now high and dry. And so that whole system had to be reworked. You had to link it up to a new main diversion canal further up. But that also meant, if you think about the geometry, that you were able to irrigate a smaller amount of land in the area that you had previously been working. So you either had to shift your whole field system, or you had to abandon parts of it to only irrigate the part that was closest to along the riverbank. And so you were caught in this catch-22 type of situation. You could keep it working, but it was going to take more work, more labor. And so this may have been one of the things that incentivized the creation of these larger villages, because more labor organized around larger and larger projects would have been a key factor to a possible solution to this problem. And so this may have also led to the development of hierarchical organizational structures. So as we see the development of these hierarchical organizational structures, it is an interesting question how inequality among the Hohokam existed, to what degree it existed, what forms did it take. Clearly there were roles for people in society, because you've got this necessity to have structured labor directed to particular activities. It's not going to be enough for each family to just maintain its section. So clearly there are leadership roles. Clearly it's not every family for themselves. And clearly there are shifts in the centralization of power within these communities. However, there's limited evidence for aggrandizing leadership roles in these communities. We just don't see, even though we have a better record of individuals as with the shift to burial as opposed to cremation. Um, there just doesn't seem to be a massive amount of structural inequality visible in Hohokam society, at least as it's traditionally identified in the archaeological record. Again, that does not mean that it was egalitarian. It just means that the ways in which people are seen, as the deceased, as they're moving on, in no time of Hohokam history reached the level where you have anything approaching a chiefly tomb like you see at places like Cahokia or even in later Chaco Canyon with some of these massive deposits of turquoise and sacrificed people. So it's interesting, but at the larger villages of the Hohokam, the ritual and political events became increasingly centralized to the populations of these particular locales, and access to participation in them was more and more restricted. So, what had been a more open system of participation in the functions of society became consolidated in the hands of fewer people, even if those people were within their own group did not have nearly as many layers of hierarchy, if that makes any sense. It was the people who were at the most important sites that controlled the irrigation systems that had the most influence within wider Hohokam society. But within an individual Hohokam community, the evidence for structural inequality is very slight. And so it's a much debated issue, a really interesting question, to be honest with you, that I don't think has been fully resolved. Hohokam art is remarkable for a number of things. One of their major areas of excellence are these elaborate etched and carved shell objects. They're even etching into shells using acid to create these very fine details. Their ceramic tradition is highly decorated with these repeated motifs. It's very distinctive in contrast to some of the other traditions. It's very different from the mimbres of the Magillon or the black on white of the Anasazi. You can really tell Hohokam ceramics. But one of the things that is really exceptional among the Hohokam is their mosaic work in things like turquoise and shell, and the combination of these different materials into some really remarkable examples of ancient art. And they probably also had a great deal of feather work. Recent investigations have turned up fragments and residues of feathers in some of these offertory caches that I was telling you about from some of these platform mounds. Finds from other areas in the region have demonstrated that both parrots and macaws were being traded, or at least their feathers. In some cases, live birds were being traded up into the area. And given the amount of refinement of their craft and the presence of the representations on ceramics of people wearing feathered headgear, it's almost certain that one of the other crafts that the Hohokam were doing was feather work and the creation of beautiful art in that format as well. Here you can see some more examples of those ceramics and shell work here. Really beautiful. Lots of frogs figure prominently, and birds, frogs and water birds which perhaps should not be that surprising given what we've just been talking about. Frogs and water birds would have been constant presence for these people. If you can imagine what the night would have sounded like in the desert with all these irrigation canals and the frogs and turtles and water birds in them would have been a constant reminder. Here you can see another one of the very, very distinctive Hohokam artifacts. And it's worth talking about these. This is a what's called a three-quarter grooved stone axe. And you do not see these kinds of artifacts being manufactured in places like Alta or Baja California. They are very particular to the Hohokam, even other First Nations of the Southwest region. For example, in the Four Corners there, we don't see the presence of these. And I think what it has to do with is a couple of things. These, as you can tell from their format, are useful as both a sledgehammer and an axe, depending on which end you use. And the fact that to develop these kinds of irrigation systems, you not only have to clear fields of brush and whatnot, but in southern Arizona, you have extensive stands of mesquite, particularly along water courses. And if you're going to be digging these deep canals and you're going to then be lining them with clay, and they need to be a particular shape and they need to run in this direction. Again, you're not just making some sort of random serpentine path through the landscape. You're going to have to be cutting through a lot of mesquite roots. You're going to have to be pounding a lot of stakes in the ground to make these head gates and irrigation control systems. And this was the artifact developed during the pre-classic period by the Hohokam as something that became a very distinctive tool of doing this kind of agriculture in this region. And that's why you see it being so linked to this tradition as opposed to some of the others in the region, is that they were the only ones who were doing this kind of work, because that's what this tool is. This is a symbol of work. They were the only ones doing this kind of work in North America, north of Mesoamerica, and west of the Mississippi. And so anytime you see something like this, this is a Hohokam three-quarter grooved stone axe, and developed specifically for the labor of these people. Their trade networks are remarkable as well. You see shell from the Pacific coast. You see copper bells, parrots, and rubber from Mesoamerica. All of those ball courts where they're playing this Mesoamerican ball game, distinctly part of that southern tradition that included chocolate and macaws and parrots and maize, beans, all of these things. The parrots and rubber are coming up, and they have actually excavated a rubber ball from one of the Hohokam ball courts. You see obsidian coming from a number of different sources throughout New Mexico and Arizona, even some from Nevada and Utah, making their way into southern Arizona. You get turquoise from northern Arizona and New Mexico. The map on the bottom right gives you an idea of just some of the places that these materials are both coming into Hohokam core sites and going out from to these different areas. They were extensively tied into the rest of the world. And in fact, there have even been Hohokam artifacts found in the San Fernando Valley, here near CSUN, up near Chatsworth. There was an archaeological site excavated that produced a number of fragments of a Hohokam ceramic vessel. And so this tradition is tied directly even into our neck of the woods here. Their landscape management was also remarkable. In addition to the irrigated fields of maize, beans, squash, and turkeys, the Hohokam had a sophisticated system of both plant husbandry, if you will, as well as carefully managed hunting and gathering. The agave fields that they had in these upland areas in the hillsides away from the water courses, that there was no practical way to irrigate or grow the maize, beans, and squash, especially during the classic period as things are drier. They began to manage the agave stands, and they would harvest the agave, and then they would create these mounds of rock mulch and plant the small pops of agave in these ideally drained locations. And they were able to dramatically increase the productivity of these areas, dramatically increase the density of agave growing in these areas. And so whether you want to call that a field, whether you want to say that's agave agriculture, or whether they're just kind of helping it along in its natural setting, it's an interesting question, because we're not talking about sensu strictu hunter-gatherers, managing the landscape. These are agriculturalists who know how to grow plants. If they wanted to take an agave and take it down and plant it in one of their fields, they could do that. But they're using different parts of the landscape and applying these different kinds of strategies, these cultivation strategies and knowledge that they've picked up over the centuries and millennia, in fact, to really pull everything that they can from the landscape in a more sustainable fashion. Because if you just go up there and harvest the agave and make no effort to replant or make no effort to increase the productivity, these large settlements, remember 1,000 to 2,000 people, they're going to strip that landscape of the agave pretty darn quickly. And so this is clearly with sustainability of the system in mind. It's interesting. They also extensively harvested wild plants, including mesquite, amaranth, quinopods, saguaro and prickly pear, nopal cactus, tansy mustard. The list, goes on and on. So they are sort of using all of the above answer to surviving through these difficult times, and in fact thriving in these contexts. However, all things, as they do, eventually come to an end, and the collapse of the Hohokam system comes shortly after the beginning of the Little Ice Age, around 1450. We see the abandonment of most Hohokam settlements and a catastrophic decline in regional population. The ultimate catalyst, and I use that word specifically rather than cause, but the ultimate catalyst was probably the shifting climate between the medieval warm period and following Little Ice Age, which lasted up until the contact period. Part of this is not entirely a temperature changes cause human behavior or anything, but because the canal systems which the Hohokam had developed to survive the droughts of the period between 1150 and 1300 served them very well until the monsoon rains returned to the southwest. At that point, the complex networks became nearly impossible to maintain, since populations were no longer expanding during this difficult time. Because as you get monsoon rains, as we talked about earlier, these catastrophic floods, they're going to cause downcutting, like you see here in this photograph, of these stream channels, which then means we've got to rework the whole irrigation system. We have to dig a whole new canal diversion from this stream, and it's got to be further upriver than it was before. And so the canals get longer and longer. As the canal gets longer, it's going to cost more labor to maintain it, especially if you get, in 3 or 4 or 5 years, another one of these floods that then knocks everything apart. And that's just talking about the main diversion canal. It's going to cause havoc in the lower parts of the system as well. So once the canal systems began to collapse, once they stopped being able to maintain them, it became a cascade failure. Public works have to be maintained. Infrastructure, right? That's how everything runs. And so once that became an increasing problem, it just became a negative feedback loop within the system. Tack on to this the fact that this little ice age created a significant drop in temperatures. And so before, they had been able to get oftentimes 2 harvests, at least of some of their crops, out of their fields, which is a huge increase in productivity. During the Little Ice Age, and as late as the winter of 1846, some people put the end of the Little Ice Age at about 1850 or somewhere in the late 19th century, ice was known to flow down the Rio Grande as far south as Las Cruces, New Mexico. And that you can look this up, a number of historic accounts going all the way back to the Spaniards in the 1600s, all the way up, so that this was not an isolated event. Get it? Isolated? Anyway. So you get that happening. The temperatures are dropping, and the irrigation canals are getting harder to maintain, and you're only able to get 1 crop out of it a year. That's going to, create a significant problem, especially since you've compressed your populations into these large centers instead of being distributed across the landscape. Additionally, fields that had been irrigated for centuries now began to develop ever higher quantities of salts in the topsoil, lowering the productivity still further. It is one of the main rivers that they're using is the Salt River, right? It's not actually salt water, but it does have a fairly high content of mineral salts. And this is a problem that we actually face today in places like the Central Valley. You see increasing salinity in the topsoil, which decreases productivity, which leads you to have to use GMO crops that can resist the salt, pesticides, fertilizers, all of that create, again, one of these feedback loops that either exacerbates the problem or causes a failure. But these were issues that the Hohokam themselves were having to deal with. None of these crises by themselves would have resulted in an immediate collapse, but the experienced and knowledgeable Hohokam people would have seen the writing on the wall and been virtually powerless to stop it. They knew enough about how things worked to realize that this was not headed in a positive direction. It's interesting to ponder the psychology of that situation. And in the region today, and in the historically documented past, at the contact, the area occupied by the distinctive Hohokam tradition for at least 1,000 years was only sparsely occupied at the time of European contact by Piman-speaking peoples. Today referred to as the Hohokam. You have the Tohono O'odham and the Akimel O'odham, sometimes referred to in your texts as Pima and Papago. Interestingly, in their own oral traditions, the Pima describe a large-scale conflict that fits the definition of warfare, with communities being destroyed and populations driven out or massacred between their immediate ancestors and the Hohokam inhabitants of the Great Compounds. Like many of these legendary histories, it involves the occupants of the Great Compounds becoming arrogant and the priests becoming powerful, and then depending on the specific version that you relate, either disaffected people from that society or people from outside the society sort of bring down the justice of history on increasingly arrogant and out-of-touch political structures. And in this particular telling, the ancestors of the O'odham are presented as the victorious party in this conflict. What is a matter of significant debate is how closely related the Pima and Papago are to the people who built the great compounds and sophisticated irrigation systems of the region. It's also possible that the human-speaking people of today of the Colorado River may be the descendants of the Hohokam, either or To say that the human-speaking people of the Colorado River may be some among the descendants of the people of the Hohokam system would not necessarily preclude their also being ancestral to some of the O'odham people, as is true throughout all of these histories that we've been talking about this semester. It's complicated, right? And you can have ancient history and traditions of the past be ancestral to more than one contemporary ethnic group, right? And I think it's interesting to consider this. This is a really kind of fascinating question to me. And so your assignment is to read the article by Lynn Teague, 2009, that's posted to the Canvas site. This is homework, no kidding. This will be on the exams in addition to the lecture. Really want to get your opinions about this particular article. So for not for Monday, but for Wednesday's class, I would like you guys to post a comment about the Lynn Teague article to the discussion board. Thank you very, very much. I hope you guys are all doing well, and I look forward to talking with you again soon. Have a good day.